So thanks everyone for joining us tonight for this Wonder Hour. If you have questions, like I mentioned a little bit ago, you can ask them in the chat box and I will ask them throughout the presentation. You could also unmute yourself and ask or raise your hand and we'll try to grab them. And if you think of it as we go and you just want to ask it, we'll also have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So the other thing is if something happens and you have to run away or serve dinner to kids or something, we will share a recording of this program and the full presentation later. So I just have to make a note for the tech side of things of when to start that recording. So, all right, first I'll tell you a little bit more about us. In its simplest form, Great River Greening takes the bad and makes it beautiful. We transform threatened natural areas, those overrun by invasive species, erosion, or suffering in response to our changing climate, into healthy, resilient ecosystems. With some of the top ecologists in the region on our team, Great River Greening protects Minnesota's waterways, restores our public parks, sustains native wildlife, and pushes the needle towards a more sustainable model for agriculture. We make and keep Minnesota beautiful. So if you've hiked in our regional parks or bring your family to a lake or even ridden your bike along the river, you have seen our work without even knowing it. We've touched more than 400 parks and lakes across the state. So sometimes it's easier to understand what we do by understanding what we don't do and how we are different. Great River Greening doesn't participate in an advocacy or land acquisition. We have partners that do that work. Instead, we do the actual restoration work, getting our hands dirty, planting trees, removing invasives, reviving shorelines, and finding natural solutions to environmental problems. And my favorite part is we do all this alongside thousands of volunteers, including kids and teens. So tonight we'll be learning about native seeds. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the work Great River Greening is doing with native pollinator plants and their seeds. So with a rising demand for native seed and a desire for specific plant varieties, it's sometimes hard for commercial seed suppliers to meet our need. They lack the inventory for our restoration work. So with funding support from the Butler Family Foundation and the General Mills Foundation, a few years ago, Great River Greening created pollinator seed banks across the metro area from Woodbury to Chanhassen. Rather than mix the species throughout the area, the plantings are organized, as you might see in a nursery, with specific species plots, making harvesting the seed easier for the future. Once matured, the grasses and flowering forbs in these places will provide food and nesting habitat for bees, butterflies, and other pollinator species. This past fall, we took our first seed harvest from a planting site we created in Lake Elmo with the support of student volunteers from Dakota County Technical College. And this is just the first of many. So it's a pretty exciting project we have and a cool thing we've done to solve one of our problems in the past. Now I'll take a moment to introduce, he walked off screen right when I'm going to talk about him. I'll take a moment to introduce Wiley, who will be presenting tonight. Wiley is our longest tenured employee at Great River Greening. He recently celebrated his 17th anniversary with us. His current work focus is in central Minnesota and the Anoka Sand Plain. He also leads our prescribed burn program and prescribed grazing implementation. And with that, I'll turn the program over to Wiley to take it away.
Thanks, Meredith. Thanks, everybody. I am gonna take us over to a PowerPoint presentation just so I can keep it organized for you all. But as Meredith said, feel free to send comments through the chat line. We'll try to remember to take breaks, or she'll interrupt if it's something timely, or, you know, by all means, it's a small group, so feel free to interrupt with questions too. So give me a second here. I'm gonna start my screen share, which of course will work seamlessly. So again, thanks for joining us and giving me a chance to share some of the enthusiasm I have for some of these things that I'm lucky enough to think about, at least for part of my work week. I am a trained ecologist, and I still wonder about some things sometimes. So I appreciate Meredith's title to this program, The Wonder Hour, because I get curious about things too in the native world. So technical, there we go. All right, so before we get into what the window to the world is, I'm gonna just have to go back a little bit and we'll refresh all of ourselves on seeds, plants, and the little chemical factories that they are. I come at this at, I'm not a plant biologist, so there's people out there who know about seed chemicals and things better than I do. I come at it as an ecologist. So I look at seeds as the population strategy for plants to perpetuate. Talk about that. And then we'll get into the window to Minnesota prairies and what seed germination technique called cold moist stratification, what that tells us about prairies. And we'll do something similar to wetlands and riparian zones on surface germination. And then we're gonna do a planting video, which is the replacement for what we wanted to do a year ago, and I'll get together and do some planting together, but we've got a video for you. So, all right, so just a real high-level overview of all this stuff. So there's a lot of seeds out in the world, a lot of diversity. This is kind of 3 case studies here. These are the actual plants that we have seeds for in the video. So they made it to this list. On the left is Meadow Blazing Star. On the far left is it in its cleaned state, and it's got a dime there for size reference. And then on the right hand side of that, you can see its small parachute. And then in the upper right, we've got rose milkweed. I think we all know how milkweeds are famous for their parachutes. And that's true for rose milkweed. And then on the left, you can see that it's a bigger seed, much easier to identify. And then in the lower right, another parachute seed, smooth blue aster, and the smallest seed of them all. So yeah, first thing to remember is that these plants produce a tremendous number of seeds every year. Asters, a single aster plant will produce 1,000 or more. Another strategy with seeds are kind of the ones that just drop. These are some important prairie plants. Lead plant on the left, which is a really desirable semi-shrub. And you can see the seeds there. Similarly, the prairie clover, which is a important pollinator plant and also a plant that does well in seedings, that's on the upper right. And both of those seeds have kind of papery husks before they get cleaned. So the pictures you see are clean seed, but when they come off the plant, they've got some papery husk. Hoary puccoon in the lower right, that's a really desirable native plant. It's not very common. It's got a small white seed that kind of clings to the stem there. Looks like some of them have turned black. That's a great plant, and I kind of throw that in there. A little fun fact about hoary puccoon is that it's notoriously hard to germinate in a greenhouse. So most of us don't understand everything about germination. I did happen to notice that there is a Minneapolis nursery that is now advertising that they've figured it out and you can buy hoary puccoon from them. So, but that's the first local nursery that I've known for 20 years that can successfully germinate. So there is a little bit of mystery to some of the plants still. And of course, that nursery is being guarded on their secret, so we don't know everything about it, most of us. So kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, we're looking at some of the massed trees and shrubs. Just a reminder that there's some, animal symbiosis here going on. On the left are the bur oaks. One at the top is one from Minnesota. The one at the bottom are the same species, but from Kansas. And another fun fact, bur oaks are known to just increase the size of their acorns the further south you go. Also, if we pause and think about it, this is a good one. A mature oak will produce like 5,000 acorns a year, and they're long lived, so easily they can have 20 years of producing acorns. So that's about 100,000 acorns conservatively. And really, from the population standpoint, they only need one of those to make it to maturity to keep their population stable and replace it. So if you think about how much energy bur oaks put into these seeds of theirs, just for the vast majority to be eaten by squirrels or deer, it's kind of a testament to how important seeds are to plants. The middle one is prairie crabapple, a native crab. Just kind of touching on kind of the chemical nature of seeds. The prairie crab and most fruiting species, they have a germination inhibitor in the fleshy fruit. So they will not germinate unless they're eaten and passed through the gut of an animal, which makes it convenient to find fertilizer and the like. We can mimic that in the greenhouse by just washing off the fleshy material, but an interesting strategy there. And then on the right is the black walnut, also kind of a fleshy outer coat that has to be taken off by animals, squirrels in this case, before they'll germinate, because there are, again, germination inhibitors in there. But black walnuts kind of do a double whammy. They also have chemicals in that hull that exudes a germination inhibitor to their competition. So anybody who gardens or has a black walnut knows that not much grows underneath them. You don't want to put walnuts in your compost pile because they can be a problem. And for those of us who like to harvest earthworms for various reasons, you can also make a tea out of the green hull, and it will flush out all our non-native invasive earthworms, which are good for the garden, but not for natural areas, and go from there. So yeah, just in summary, so it's a seeds and germination are kind of a sophisticated chemical process that's all just been adapted throughout millennia. It's not, necessarily what the plants chose to do. It's just they've been running this genetic experiment forever, and that's what has been selected. So you can see that in the seeds, but you also see that, well, staying with the seeds, there's a number of chemicals going on there. Again, this isn't my strong suit, but the two big ones are the gibberellins, which promote germination, and then there's also the abscisic acid, and that's the one that generally inhibits germination. So again, it's kind of a sophisticated process. The plants are highly adapted to this and put a fair amount of their energy into it. But it must pay off because it is the primary way to do it. And the benefit of seeds is that it's sexual reproduction. They get half of their genetic material from one adult and the other half from another adult, more or less. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But there are some examples of kind of plants that do both a combination of seeds and asexual reproduction. One of those is the native sumac, which once it sprouts a seed in an area, it'll start reproducing asexually. Basically, it just means it's got runners underneath the ground and it lives in a clone. If you see a patch of sumac, they're all kind of connected underground. The same is true for tall goldenrod, which is kind of a problem species in Minnesota restored prairies. Once it gets established by seed, it will start sending out stolons and rhizomes and make some pretty thick monocultures. And then also pen sedge, which is a common desirable graminoid in our woodlands. Its seed is kind of notoriously low quality, but once it does find a spot and can get a foothold, it expands mostly just by sending out runners. So just to balance that a little bit. But again, the seeds are an investment in genetic diversity. And they go to some length to protect that. So the cottonwood tree is I always have to check this. It's a monoecious plant, which means each tree hosts only one gender or one sex. So there's male cottonwood trees and female cottonwood trees. The far left, that's the male flower, which is sending out pollen. Those of us who suffer from allergies know that tree pollen season is upon us. It's dispersed by wind, and it lands on the female flower, which is the lower center. And then if you ever see those big white fluffy balls of seed floating around, sometimes in the curb, sometimes in areas that are wind protected, that's often the cottonwood seeds from female cottonwoods. People who want to plant cottonwoods and avoid that, you can go to nurseries and buy male cottonwoods, so you can get the big trees without the fluffy seed, which can cause problems. So most plants, though, they have both sexes in them, but they'll have male and female flowers, and that's what we see on the aster to the right. And then a lot of plants go the extra step of trying not to self-pollinate. So they'll adjust their timing on when they produce their male flowers and when they produce their female flowers. So in the spirit of wondering, that's what I've been told. I don't see it very often. Maybe others do see that, but to me, it seems like the timing mechanism, I have yet to see a clear example of it, but maybe others have comments on that. But that's a more believed to be a more common method to avoid getting both sets of genes from the same parent. Now that said, asters are the champions at avoiding self-fertilization. They have some sort of chemical mechanism or some sort of mechanism where if they are fertilized by the same plant, the seeds come out sterile. So in practice, that just means if you want a lot of asters and a lot of aster seedlings, get more than one. If you want to just enjoy the one aster seed without having it spread, you can just buy one, and the seeds will be sterile and not spread. All right, so how do these seeds start? So as sophisticated as the seeds are, and as successful as they are as a population strategy for plants, and all the chemical processes that go into germination, and all the investment that plants make into it, even though the majority of them never make it to be to replace them as a mature reproducing adult. They do have a shelf life. We can take seeds and we can put them in a packet and put them in our car and drive them around, and we can put them in the fridge or leave them downstairs or leave them in the car, and they're still relatively viable. But in a lot of ways, they're just support staff for the seedling stage, because anybody who's grown anything or seen anything, once it becomes a seedling, it's really critical. You can't let it dry out, you can't let it get too cold, can't let it get too hot, can't pull it, can't eat it, and things like that. So really, there's just a lot of sophistication about when seeds will germinate. And that's what we're going to talk about. And this is kind of where we're going to start talking more about how this is a window into the world of native prairies and prairie management. So like the seeds we buy for tomatoes and all that, native prairie seeds, even though prairie plants are super tough, the seeds and the seedlings still need soil contact. If you're like my brother-in-law and you throw milkweed seeds on a brome field like on the left, you're not going to get anything to come up. If you're making a prairie and you have a bare field like on the right, you can do things to really increase the seed to soil contact. And this is what you see here is just something called a cultipacker, which kind of breaks up the dirt and then smooths it out a little bit and prepares the seed bed. So, and then the other thing is light. A lot of seeds will not germinate. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. Most seeds are either adapted to need light to germinate, or others are adapted to need dark to germinate. And the reason behind that is that those seeds need to be buried in soil. They don't want to germinate unless they know they're buried in soil. So how do they, that's one of the ways that they can tell that they've got some seed to soil contact, is that they're buried. The other one is moisture. And a third one is, we're going to talk about, is timing. Like, how do they know it's a good time of year to sprout? And that's when we get into something called cold moist stratification. This is kind of a horticultural term. And it basically is here to mimic winter. What practitioners do, what growers do for prairie seed is that many of them need a certain number of days where they're moist, not wet, and they're cold, but not too cold and not too hot. So basically, you can take these seeds, harvest them in the fall, and you can put them in either moist sand or moist vermiculite or something like that, and put them in the refrigerator. And that is a good way a successful way to mimic winter. And then it's known that the interesting thing, for me anyway, is that different species need different lengths of time. And this is where it kind of, gets interesting with prairies. So again, with the sky blue aster, that's kind of a mesic or medium moisture prairie plant. And it doesn't need any days of cold, moist stratification. In the same prairie system, our beloved meadow blazing star, which is, the monarch magnet, it needs a full 60 days of cold, moist stratification. And if you wonder about that, it's like, well, how does it get 60 days of cold, moist stratification? I mean, clearly during snow melt, you can get an extended period of time, but 60 days is I think that's fairly long, fairly lengthy to get these kind of somewhat even conditions. But that's what we know to be the ideal amount of cold, moist stratification. And you think, well, if we move to a wetter prairie, maybe those seeds prefer an even longer period, but no, that's not the case. In a wetter prairie, wet music prairie, we get the rose milkweed, and it needs half of what the meadow blazing star needs, which is in a drier prairie. So to me, I find that pretty curious. And the range is even greater than this. A lot of the prairie species need 0 to 60 days. But there are some species out there that need 90 days of cold moist stratification. Others, a few, that even need 120 days of cold moist stratification. And it's all the way, all as a means for the plants to know that they are sprouting in the spring, and not some other time of year. At least those with more than 0 days. The prairie grasses, they need 0 days. They're kind of a different beast. They're monocots, so they're physiologically quite different than the forbs, which are dicots. And then, of course, the question, what does this tell us? Well, in terms of practice, the prairie restoration industry, when it first started getting going, was really, really good at growing prairie grasses. They're super easy. We all planted them in the spring, and we'd get these big solid stands of grass, which were pretty handsome and colorful, but not a lot of prairie forbs. And there was some misconception on what a prairie really should look like. But I don't know, about the beginning of this millennium, we all got a little smarter and said, okay, well, we are really lacking forbs. And there's actually a study done on locally that showed that old fields had more flowers than some reconstructed prairies. So that wasn't good. So the key here is to, now that we know that these seeds have these different requirements, is to actually give them winter. And it's called a dormant season seeding. We can throw the seed down now between fall and early spring. We can throw it on top of the snow. Ideally, we do multiple seed rains. Again, some seeds need different amounts of time than others. And we never know, one never knows what the snow melt is going to be like. But we don't want to throw it down. We don't always want to throw it down early, because there is significant herbivory on these seeds from the mice and the voles. So that was a big lesson that we learned about, from the germination characteristics of forbs, is we get much more diverse prairies if we can plant in the fall. We can't always do that. But there's also an effort now, a little more recently, about going back to some of these overly grassy prairies and interseeding them with the flower seeds. And to get the seed to soil contact, we have to tie that in with some sort of disturbance, because again, they're pretty thickly vegetated and things like that. And the two main disturbances are fire, which gets rid of the thatch. And if we go down and throw seeds in right after fire, we get much better seed to soil contact. And then also grazers. And I've included the picture of elk because most of us remember that, the iconic bison that were native to Minnesota, but we oftentimes don't think so much about the elk, which would actually stick around in greater numbers during the winter. But both of them, elk and bison, they were kind of periodic grazers. They would come in very intensely to the point of disturbing the soil and then move off, and the prairie would get years of rest. It's a little hard to mimic, but that's exactly what we tried to do. The upper right is a picture of some sheep we had out at Pilot Knob, a site of ours in Mendota Heights. This was actually using them to control a non-native grass, but much to my surprise, there were some blazing stars that sprouted up in the area that was being grazed. Complete volunteers. Hadn't seen them on the site for a couple of years, and they're not around in high numbers. But sure enough, that grazing activity, and we ended up getting some blazing star to come back. So again, this is the aim of what we want for prairies. Very rich in flowers, great pollinator habitat, still some grass component, which is important for grazers, important for fire, important for shelter for animals. And now Greening's doing a project. We're going back to some extra grassy prairies with the Fish and Wildlife Service up at the Crane Meadows Wildlife Refuge. This is up in Little Falls, kind of far. My area goes from Blaine to Brainerd right now. But if you're ever in Little Falls, I recommend going to the Crane Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. It's got some great spots, some great bird life. But what we're doing there is we're going to be burning these overly grassy prairies and then using the cultipacker to both prepare the seed bed before we throw a seed down. But now the state of the art just recently is to not only do it before the seed goes down, but then to roll over it with a cultipacker again. What we used to do was take a smooth roller and kind of smooth it out and increase the seed to soil contact. But there's some better results with using a cultipacker, which is kind of curious because it's kind of rough and it makes these, you know, kind of some uneven surfaces. So in my mind, this cultipacker is much better at mimicking grazing because that kind of rough surface and uneven is pretty similar to what like hooves would do if they were in a prairie. So to me, this mimics grazing. And with that, I think with these smaller, you know, micro disturbances, we're getting a difference in moisture. Like some areas are drier, others are have a little bit more moisture just because they're an inch or two lower than the rest of it. And I think that's probably what's behind it. So again, we have these different moisture requirements for mesic prairie species. And to me, this is all an indication that forbs are adapted to fire and grazing. We get the best results if we mimic that. And so that's kind of a big leap from just knowing what forbs need to germinate. All right, so moving on to the wetland species, another common germination requirement is that they need to be on the surface of the soil. They're very small, so these seeds tend to, you know, stay up high. And this is a common strategy for wetland and riparian species like Joe Pye weed and blue vervain, and a lot of others, emergence. Even plants that, when they're adults, they grow, part of them, their stems are underwater, but to germinate, they need to be on top of the mud and on top of the muck. And it's really indicative of plants that have adapted to what a river is supposed to do. So here is a historic photo of the St. Croix River on the kind of iconic lift bridge, which is now a pedestrian bridge. So if you haven't been there in a while, it's a nice walk. But this is a historic photo, and I think you can make out that, you know, in the middle of the river is so shallow that there's some land exposed, both under the bridge and then upstream of it. And this is what a river is supposed to do. The water is supposed to get low in the fall. And these wetland seeds, they require that to germinate. If you go to the St. Croix River now, it never ever gets this low. It's full bank to bank, just like all of our rivers. Oops, sorry, I guess I'm being a little wordy and going over. I'll try and hurry it up here. Knowing that seed behavior and what it needs is guides that sort of wetland and riparian management. And there's been all sorts of drawdowns on the Mississippi River. It'll be curious to see if any plants germinate after that St. Anthony Falls drawdown, even though that was pretty brief. We may see some more vegetation coming up. So this is the kind of the full list of different germination requirements that plants have. This A list here, this is what you get when you buy your tomato seeds. They don't really need anything. Just give them a little water and give them some heat and they'll sprout. There's plenty of plants that do that. And here's the second half of the full set. And in this is just kind of this weird one. There are some seeds that need to go through 2 winters, basically, before they'll germinate. So in the spirit of wondering, I cannot personally figure out what advantage any seed would have to do that, but there are some that do that. So still wondering, and with that, we'll wrap it up. So yeah, in conclusion, it's germination is triggered by all sorts of things. The seedling stage is the most vulnerable, so that's what its seeds are adapted to. Really helps us better understand prairie and fire disturbance and its relationship to flower component. It leads to a lot better prairie practices and a lot better riparian and wetland practices. And still more to learn. All right, well, with that, we're going to go back to Meredith. Yeah.
But I'll let an opportunity now, if anyone has any questions before I share my screen. We planned this, Wiley and I were going to host this Winter to the World Native Seeds last March. So we prepped some seeds so we could plant them in person in a group in a lab setting last March. So we recorded Wiley planting those seeds so you guys can see that part of it. And 20 of you actually got those seeds. So as Wiley, we watched the video of Wiley planting, we'll talk more about that. But if anyone has any questions after all of that knowledge, you could go ahead and unmute right now, and otherwise I'll get ready to play that video.
And you will see Meredith's hand too, a couple times, I think.
I don't know, I tried to edit it out.
Okay.
I have a question.
All right, Allie.
Hi, thank you. This was so interesting.
Okay.
I'm wondering now that I have some native plants that have grown for a few years in my yard. Can I just harvest the seeds and plant them elsewhere or give them away? Is there anything special that has to be done, or just look up the instructions for that seed and pass them on with the seed?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the vast majority of plants will do just fine if you harvest them and throw them down on the ground in the fall, if you're trying to spread them in your garden. Okay. I would add to that is just pay a little bit of attention to when they naturally fall off the seed head, because there are some that will drop all their seeds, like bergamot will drop all their seeds by October. But there's others, like some of the coneflowers, they'll still have a tight head of seeds into the winter, and it takes kind of a windstorm or a storm of some sort to knock them off. So, so in general, just planting them in the fall is great, but you might do a little better if you just try and mimic what happens to them naturally.
So it would be bad to peel them off before they're kind of releasing on their own.
Yeah, usually if they're, if they're ripe, you usually can pull them off. If it's really hard to pull them off, it probably means they're not quite fully developed. But If you
Okay.
can get them off, then yeah, I would say you're fine, that they're viable seeds.
Thank you.
One point is that, you know, unlike the tomato seeds we buy, where, you know, 95% of them are viable, there's a lot that can happen to plants, their native plants, and their seeds will not be viable. If they're stressed, if they're alone, they won't do it all that well. If it's just a bad moisture year, they may go ahead and make seeds, and you really won't know their viability, because they'll look fine on the outside, but they're not always fully developed on the inside.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll watch Wiley plant and he can tell us what he's doing. What was that mystery dirt I mailed to everyone?
All right, so following up on that comment that you know, native seeds don't always have the highest germination rate, and then on top of that, these seeds are a year old. Made the decision to put them in a germination.
You're good.
Germination flat. Which is, in my opinion, it's easier to do that than it is to try and individually plant seeds when you're not sure very many of them will come up. So this way you can put them in a germination flat and then you can transplant the seedlings. So right now I'm just grabbing the vermiculite mix, and you'll see that they're very, very shallow seeds. You don't want to plant forb seeds deep at all. Basic rule of thumb is twice as big as they are. So keep them shallow.
And so for those folks that got seeds in the mail, what he's planting is the blazing star.
Yeah, when I opened up the bag, we certainly couldn't identify blazing star seeds. So at that point, we made the decision to put them in a germination tray.
The other thing I found interesting as I prepped for this, so other than learning what vermiculite was and how we would use it, and baffling my local hardware store when I bought it a year ago, Wiley, also you recommended that I get the organic potting soil for getting this stuff down.
Yeah, pretty key. One of the worst family of pesticides for our pollinators are neonicotinoids, and they're a soil herbicide, a soil residual herbicide. So the non-organic potting soil, you run the risk of having neonicotinoids in them. And those neonicotinoids are taken up by the plants all the way to the nectar. And so the bees and the butterflies come by and they'll get their nectar and pollen, but they'll be harmed by the neonicotinoids that are just in the potting soil. So you definitely want to make sure you don't buy potting soil with neonicotinoids in it.
So that was the asters that went in. And now we will fast forward to the next planting.
Yeah, so now we're doing the rose milkweed, which is a much larger seed, and we can pick it out of the vermiculite mix. Meredith had a great idea of bringing the ruler over, and that way I could get a decent estimate on the depth of the seed hole. And sometime in here, well, first of all, you saw Meredith's hand come in and help pick them out, but these did have an extended cold moist stratification period, so I am a little concerned about their viability. So instead of planting 1 per cell, I just doubled up and planted 2 in each cell. Just for me anyway, that's just kind of a labor saving thing to do down the road.
If you wanted to do milkweed on your own, like you didn't buy a seed pack, but you collected the fluffy in the winter, could you, is it beneficial to milkweed if you tried to start them yourself into seedlings like this? Or is it better to just grab the fluff and spread it outside? So it would do it like naturally.
Some of both.
Okay.
Milkweed fluff is you want to get rid of the fluff pretty quickly. You don't even want to bring it in your garage, or at least I won't anymore, because if you get one of those parachutes stuck in your throat, it's really, really uncomfortable. It's easiest to take them off the parachutes right when they're still in the pod. You can just flick them off with your thumb. So some of both. So if you've got cleaned milkweed seed without the parachutes on them, then yeah, go ahead. They do require 30 days. They'll do a lot better if you give them 30 days of moist time in the refrigerator and then bring them out.
Okay. Oops.
Another option, kind of like what we were implying, is that you could also take them in the fall and put them in your planting trays in the fall and just leave the trays outside or in the garage.
I lost my video, but there wasn't too much more left for us. So the blue aster did not go out in the mail, but it was part of the demonstration we had. You want to tell us more about it?
We've covered quite a bit. It's just, Prairie Moon, a lot of the info I was sharing was from them. They have a great amount of information on their website. And you can see in their seed pack at the very bottom, they'll give you the germination code. Germination code A, that's the same as 0 days of cold moist stratification. So. And then the blazing star again, this one does best with 60 days of cold moist stratification. And then the rose milkweed, which likes it a little bit wetter, it only needs 30 days. So before it will germinate.
And so Wiley and I planted those 2 weeks ago, and I've been babysitting them. So here's what they look like yesterday. The blazing star is on the left and the smooth blue aster is on the right. I'm very proud plant parent because we have seedlings. So follow-up question, since I'm babysitting these, and if I was growing them at home, how long do they stay in that starter tray before they would be moved to like a bigger pot or the actual yard if you're starting seeds, native seeds at home?
Yeah, you'll definitely want to let them get bigger so they can handle being transplanted. But they do better transplanting the younger you can get them. So I would give them another week maybe, and then then go.
And then go into a bigger pot and let them grow more, or go dig a hole into the ground?
Too early to go outside yet. So a bigger pot. If you're taking them from here straight outside, it's probably best to just do one transplant and keep them in the germination tray for a month or more. Okay. Just make sure they're, evenly moist and getting some sun, because this is their critical spot. They don't have any food reserves left, so they need to start making their food.
Okay.
We forgot to tell them that actually on Prairie Moon's webpage, they have a little more information about blue aster than they have on their seed packet. And blue aster actually likes, after it's put in the soil, it likes a period of cool soil and then move to warmer soil. So,
which I mimicked by keeping them in my basement to start. And now they're happy because I brought them upstairs and they're
Yep.
getting some more sun.
and it worked. So,
And then here's the rose milkweed in the starter packs. No sprouts yet. So I'm sad plant parent there.
So one of the things you can do, which is really nice for seedlings, is Meredith is watering them from below here. So those plastic trays, they have holes on the bottom and they're soaking water up from the bottom to the top. Especially in the seedling stage, it's hard to water them, except maybe with a sprayer, but you don't get much water with a sprayer. It's hard to water them without, on the top, without kind of turning them upside down. So bottom watering, I'm a big fan of bottom watering.
All right. Does anyone have any questions?
Just
yeah.
kind of from what I put in the chat, just to clarify, are these seeds good to go, like be planted, or should we put them and start a cold stratification process?
They're ready to go. They're more than ready to go. They've the date on the baggie is the date that they went in the fridge.
Okay.
So they're ready to go. If you've had them for a couple of days, some of the seeds will sprout in the baggie. So take a look. Blazing Star is actually really known for that. You get a lot of sprouting in the bag. So try not to give them direct sun, because that'll start the germination inhibition process. But you know, just room light and indirect sun should be fine.
So what I sent in the mail can go into yards, or they should throw the seeds in pots or starter trays. Like if you left them in the baggie because you weren't going to start them in a tray or a seed, like a pot, when could you throw them in your yard?
Yeah, if they're still seeds, you can throw them in the yard. Yep. If you can work the soil up and make the soil kind of loose for them, go ahead and spread them in the yard. Yeah.
And then we have a question about the rose milkweed, and not so much about the plant, but the pollinators that use it. Do monarchs lay their eggs on the rose milkweed?
Yep, they do. And you'll find that they actually, the caterpillars actually prefer the rose milkweed seeds, milkweed leaves later in the season. Common milkweed gets a little tough and leathery for the caterpillars on their fourth and final instar. So rose milkweed will be preferred. And another technique is to actually cut some of your common milkweed mid-season so they're younger and more tender for the fall and ready for the fall migration. But yep, rose milkweed, they'll lay eggs, they'll do everything on rose milkweed.
Okay. Any other questions?
There's something about how close together to plant them in the soil.
Yeah.
Well, as you can see from the aster tray, that's closer than you want them. Want them in your yard, but we counted the seeds. Do you remember, Meredith?
No, because we did that project in February of 2020. Yeah. There's so much that's happened since I counted seeds.
Yeah.
Into baggies.
So I try to give you a clearer answer than thinking out loud. I would say, 10 square feet for the whole baggie should do it.
Any other questions, either about these seeds or other seeds or growing natives in your yard? Wiley's,
Questions.
yes, Rachel, go for it.
So I bought my first house last year, and I am still in the process of figuring out what my sun situation is going to look like for my sun and soil and wet and how all of that kind of looks.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure it's going to be shaded considering I've got a fair number of trees. But I am really committed to getting rid of the grass that I have here and just making it a no-mow for Rachel and pollinator friendly for everybody else. What are some seeds that I can consider for this fall, say, looking ahead, that will work in shade? Because a lot of it is like prairie and not a lot of trees on the prairie.
Yeah.
So I'm still trying to figure out kind of what to plan for and when to do it. Now that I've learned about cold stratification and all of that, like I'm more apt in, like, I grow tomatoes in pots. Like that's my background.
Okay. So great question. I'm glad you asked it. So maybe the first thing I would recommend is that the shade plants, their seed is notoriously expensive because it has to be hand-picked and they don't produce a lot. And then they have low viability. So for me anyway, I usually just buy the plugs for shade plants and put them in. Now, one thing that a lot of residential people don't take advantage of is that fall is a great time to plant those, because you're avoiding all the hot weather. So you put them in September, October, you might need to water them once or twice or 3 times, but then they're set. And then they're in the ground the next time the snow melts. And for most shade plants, they have a big growth spurt in the spring before it gets too shady. But there's no harm if you're all excited this spring to go and get some. Just make sure you water them during the hot weather, and they'll be fine. So
Okay. Do you have some suggestions on starter plants or like ones to try?
What I usually ask people is to grab a handful of soil and then squeeze it between your fingers, and tell me if it crumbles, if it's sandy, or if it kind of sticks together. That means you have a lot of clay. And then send me a picture of how shady your yard is, and we'll go from there. Okay.
So
That's the problem. I'm not in shade yet because there aren't leaves yet.
Okay. Well,
but they're mature trees. Like I know it's going to be shady.
Yeah, I think I'll be able to tell too.
Yeah.
So
our last Wonder Hour was about bee lawns, Wiley, with Laura and Bobby, our board members. And so Ken was part of that one too. So he had a question, like with the bee lawn, and maybe Rachel, you could check out the last Wonder Hour, but maybe the bee lawn, which comes as a seed mix. And they talked about some specific ones to do in shade during that talk too. But that's creating pollinator habitat at the grass level. And it's not no mow, but it's little mow.
Right.
And little to no watering as well. So like Ken reminded me of that. So.
Great.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Have fun playing in your yard, Rachel.
Yeah. It's just a lot to think about.
watch out for that shark behind you too.
All right. Does anyone have any other questions? All right. Seeing no hands raised or chat happening, I will call it good. If you do have more questions for Wiley, you can. I've emailed everyone, so you can email them to me and I can pass them on. Otherwise, his email is wbuck@greatrivergreening.org. So, thanks everybody, And we have a whole new series starting. Well, we have one next week on spring ephemerals to help you get outside and explore the world this spring. But then we have a whole series of wonder hours starting. We'll have one every month through summer. So check out, you should get an email about it tomorrow. So thanks all.
So, spring ephemeral should be good for Rachel and anybody with shade. So
There you go. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye, all.